While I was fighting for my life in the hospital, my parents left me alone. My roommate rented out my room and threw out my stuff. When I called her, she said, "Don't come back, we've moved on." Days later, I walked into that apartment with the new lease owner. My name is Noelle. I'm 34, living, or at least, I was living, in Lincoln Park, Chicago. I had a decent job in marketing, a rent-controlled apartment with charm and creaky floors, and a roommate I genuinely cared about. Selena was one of those people who made an impression the moment she walked into a room. Tall, striking, full of ideas and opinions. We weren't best friends, but we shared dinners, inside jokes, late-night rants about work, and plenty of those little rituals that quietly build trust. Our apartment wasn't much, a 2-bedroom, 1-bath with a window that wouldn't shut all the way in the winter and a faint smell of old wood and dust that never really went away, but it was home. My bedroom had plants in every corner, shelves lined with thrifted books, and a corkboard above my desk filled with notes, goals, memories. A little sanctuary I built one piece at a time over the years. It all started unraveling in September. I was walking home from work. It was raining lightly, but I'd forgotten my umbrella and decided to tough it out. A delivery van lost control at the intersection of North and Halsted. I was in the crosswalk. They said he was going under the speed limit, but all it takes is bad timing and slick roads. The next thing I remember was opening my eyes under hospital lights. Everything was blurry. My body felt like it had been crushed and stitched back together with burning metal. I couldn't speak at first. I remember a nurse adjusting my telling me I was lucky to be alive. That I'd been unconscious for 2 days. The days that followed were a blur of beeping machines, painkillers, questions from doctors. I had a fractured pelvis, 3 broken ribs, a concussion, internal bleeding that they barely stopped in time, and a shattered wrist that would need surgery. The worst part? No one was there. Not my parents. Not Selena. Not even a text, a card, nothing. At first, I thought maybe they didn't know. My phone had been destroyed in the accident. I asked a nurse if they'd contacted anyone. She looked through my chart and said they'd called the numbers listed. My emergency contacts. Both my parents. And Selena. We left messages, she said with a practiced gentleness. We assumed they'd be here soon. But they never came. I tried not to panic. Maybe they were out of town. Maybe their voicemails hadn't gone through. Maybe Selena had left her phone on silent. It wasn't until almost 2 weeks later, once I could hold a phone again, that I was able to call myself. I started with my mom. She answered after 2 rings. Hello? Mom, it's me. Noelle. There was a pause. Oh. Hi. I've been in the hospital. I was hit by a van walking home from work. I've been here for weeks. Another pause. That's awful, sweetheart. But we're in Arizona. We had this trip planned for a while. We didn't hear anything, figured you were just busy. Busy? She sounded more annoyed than concerned. My father didn't even come to the phone. When I asked, she said he was taking a nap and didn't want to be disturbed. I hung up, feeling like the world had gone sideways. Then I called Selena. She picked up. Her voice was hesitant, like she didn't recognize the number. Selena, it's me. Noelle. There was a long silence. You're alive? I was in a horrible accident. I've been in the ICU for weeks. Why didn't you answer the hospital's calls? Noelle. I didn't know what to think. I hadn't heard from you. You just disappeared. I didn't know where you were. I assumed, what happened to my room? I rented it out, she said, flatly. You were gone. I couldn't afford rent by myself. My things? I got rid of them. You what? I didn't have space to keep everything. I mean, you'd been gone for weeks. I thought you'd ghosted or maybe, she stopped. I'm sorry. I had to move on. I could barely breathe. Not just from the injuries, but from the sheer emotional cyber punch. You couldn't wait? Or ask? I don't need permission to protect myself, she said coldly. Look, don't come back. We've moved on. That was it. I spent another week trying to process everything. My physical therapist said I was making good progress, but mentally I was spiraling. I had no home. No possessions. No job, they had to fill my role after I missed 3 weeks without notice. And no one who gave a damn. A hospital social worker helped me get into a short-term care center in Oak Park, and from there, I started making calls. An old college friend, Nadine, stepped in to help me with insurance paperwork, and she even helped me file a claim with the driver's company. It wasn't fast money, but it was a start. It was Nadine who asked, "Have you talked to your landlord? If your name was still on the lease, she had no right to evict you or toss your things." I hadn't even thought about that. I was still stuck in survival mode. So I tracked down Mr. Avila, the landlord. He was this older guy, always wore too tight flannel shirts and smelled faintly like cigars. He answered my call on the third try. When I told him who I was, he paused. Wait. You're Noelle? Yes. I was told you left. That you broke lease and abandoned the unit. No. I was in a coma. He muttered a few curses under his breath and asked to meet in person. He offered to bring the new leaseholder, someone named Darius, and we scheduled a day to walk through the unit. I was nervous. Not because I wanted to confront Selena, I didn't care what she thought anymore, but because I didn't know what would be left. When I walked into my old apartment, it was like stepping into a stranger's house. Nothing remained. Not my art prints, my desk, my tiny reading lamp. The walls were a new color. My room had a completely different layout, and the bookshelves I built by hand? Gone. Selena was there. She looked surprised but tried to play it off like she was unbothered. She gave me a nod and leaned against the kitchen counter like I was some awkward guest overstaying a visit. You shouldn't be here, she said. And Mr. Avila stepped in, his arms crossed. Actually, she has every right. You forged her move-out paperwork. That's a lease violation, possibly criminal. Selena's face paled. That was the moment I knew, truly knew, that I wasn't just disposable to her. I was an inconvenience she'd tossed out like trash. And now, she was going to have to deal with the consequences. Darius, the new guy renting my room, stood by the window, visibly uncomfortable. He was young, maybe early 20s, with a messenger bag slung over his shoulder and a look on his face like he'd just realized he'd walked into the middle of a custody battle. He didn't say much, and I didn't expect him to. He didn't owe me anything. He was just the person who answered a Craigslist ad, thinking it was all above board. Selena, on the other hand, was squirming now. Her voice, which had always carried that confident, aloof edge, faltered slightly. I didn't forge anything, she said. I didn't know what else to do. Rent was due, and Noelle hadn't been around. You didn't contact me, I interrupted. You didn't check the hospital. You didn't even post on Facebook asking if anyone had seen me. You think I had time to do all that? She snapped. You disappeared. I panicked. No, I said, quieter now. You didn't panic. You calculated. You made choices. You didn't even keep one box of my things. Mr. Avila cleared his throat and pulled out a folded stack of papers. This is the copy of the lease you emailed me last month, the one that claims Noelle officially vacated. And this, he pulled out another paper, is the original lease with her signature. You edited the document. Selena took a step back. I didn't mean, you edited a legal lease, he said flatly. And you never notified me she was injured. I could lose my license if this kind of thing gets reported. At this point, Darius raised his hand like a student. I didn't know any of this. I just needed a room near campus. No one's blaming you, I said. But now that you know, you might want to find a new place. Because this is going to get messy. Selena suddenly seemed more tired than angry. Her whole demeanor deflated. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was just that she'd been cornered, and there was no quick comeback left in her. I didn't want to deal with it, she muttered. You don't get it, Noelle. You were always so capable. You always handled your own messes. I thought you'd figure it out, eventually. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she didn't see me as a person who needed help. She saw me as someone who'd always been strong, therefore, I didn't deserve help when I was weak. That hurt more than any of the injuries I was still healing from. After that day, Mr. Avila asked me to come by his office to discuss my legal options. It turned out I was still technically listed on the lease, even though the forged version said otherwise. The paperwork Selena had sent had inconsistencies, signatures in different ink, modified dates. Enough for him to be concerned about liability. He said he'd be willing to back me up if I decided to pursue damages. I didn't make a decision right away. I went back to Nadine's in Milwaukee to think things through. She welcomed me with open arms and a bottle of wine, even though I couldn't drink on my meds. She sat beside me on her sagging couch while I cried over the box of documents I brought home, not sure whether I was angry or just deeply, irreparably tired. My body still ached. The therapy was grueling, and the emotional weight of it all made me feel older than I was. I had to mourn not just what happened, but the loss of trust. In people I'd cared about. In my own judgment. I'd trusted Selena. I'd always known my parents were emotionally distant, but I never thought they'd just disappear when I needed them most. At some point during that first week back, I started compiling a list. Not a burn list or anything, just an inventory of what had been lost. Books. Clothes. Gifts from people I'd loved. My old journals. A handmade quilt from my aunt. My hard drive with years of writing projects and photos. The more I wrote, the angrier I became. And anger is fuel. With Nadine's encouragement, I contacted a tenants' rights attorney. We went over everything: dates, documents, the hospital records, the voicemail logs from the nurse station. It was all there. I had a clear case. Selena's choices weren't just unethical. They were illegal. The attorney said I could press charges for unlawful eviction and destruction of property. We wouldn't need to take it to court unless she refused to settle. But first, a demand letter would go out. I won't lie, I was scared to sign the paperwork. Not because I felt sorry for Selena at that point, but because part of me still hated conflict. Still wanted to believe this was all a misunderstanding that could be worked out. But it couldn't. Because people who truly value you don't discard you like this. They don't throw away your life while you're unconscious in a hospital bed. Selena received the demand letter 2 weeks later. I heard from her through a long, overly formal email. She apologized for the oversight and said she was blindsided by how things had spiraled. She also claimed she'd never meant to cause harm and offered a small amount of money to avoid a legal process. My attorney advised me to counter with an itemized breakdown: replacement costs, sentimental value estimations, loss of use. It added up to more than I expected. Thousands, even without assigning emotional worth to certain items. There was a long silence after that. No emails. No calls. Then, out of the blue, I got a Venmo notification. Half the settlement amount. The note said, to move on. Good luck. It was such a Selena thing to do, pay and simultaneously insult me. Like she still wanted to have the last word. But that's the thing, she didn't. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. About accountability. Back in Milwaukee, Nadine helped me move into a new space, tiny, 1-bedroom, with a view of Lake Michigan if you stood on your tiptoes and squinted out the kitchen window. I bought a cheap IKEA desk and slowly started rebuilding my home. One framed photo at a time. And for the first time in a long while, I began to feel something I hadn't in months. Safe. The fall crept in slowly that year. Milwaukee had this way of turning cold overnight, and before I could even unpack my second suitcase, frost had started forming on the porch railings. I remember standing at the window one morning, watching a squirrel dart across the lawn with a crust of bread, and thinking, this is what starting over feels like. Not fireworks. Not triumph. Just quiet. Cold. Survival. Physically, I was healing. I had progressed from the cane to walking slowly on my own. My physical therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Geneva, said I was ahead of schedule, considering the trauma. But emotionally, I was still piecing myself together. There was a day in October when I was sorting through a second-hand bookstore downtown. I found a dog-eared copy of Beloved, one of the books Selena had tossed, and I just stood there, holding it, frozen in the aisle. I didn't cry. I didn't even get angry. I just felt hollow. It wasn't about the book. It was about everything it represented. The version of me who had underlined those pages late at night, sipping tea by my bedroom window in Chicago. That version had been wiped away. Like I hadn't mattered. But as I ran my fingers along the cover, I realized something: I was still here. Not the same, not untouched, but present. My parents finally reached out again in early November. This time it was my father. He left a voicemail, as stiff and formal as a business memo. Noelle. It's Dad. We've heard what happened. Your mother and I are disappointed you didn't inform us directly. We were very worried. Please call back. Disappointed I hadn't told them. I played the message 3 times before deleting it. Then I blocked their numbers. I didn't have room in my life anymore for people who viewed care as a transaction, who offered love only when it was convenient. Nadine, bless her soul, never pushed me to reconnect. She had a strained relationship with her own parents and understood without me having to explain. We talked more over late dinners, curled up in her mismatched living room chairs, watching reruns of Frasier and quietly avoiding the heavier things. But life kept inching forward. I started a new job doing remote marketing work for a nonprofit in Minneapolis. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me structure and purpose. I had Zoom meetings and strategy decks and weekly check-ins with a team who only knew me as Noelle, the organized one. They didn't know what I'd been through, and that was fine by me. Sometimes, I'd walk by the lake when it was just starting to snow and let myself feel it all: the loss, the loneliness, the injustice. And then I'd let it go. Not all at once, but piece by piece. In January, something unexpected happened. I received a letter in the mail. A real letter, handwritten, on lined notebook paper, the kind that folds awkwardly into thirds and carries the smell of someone's kitchen. It was from Darius. I hadn't thought much about him since that day in the apartment. He'd looked like he wanted to melt into the wall, caught in the middle of a situation he never signed up for. But the letter was thoughtful. He said he'd moved out the same week we visited and had been crashing on a friend's couch until he could find a new place. He didn't want to be involved in any drama, but he also felt uncomfortable staying in a space built on someone else's pain, as he put it. He wrote, "I know I was just the guy in the room. But I saw your face that day, and I've been thinking about it since. I hope you're okay. If there's anything you ever need, like help moving or finding a cheap couch, I owe you one." I didn't know what to make of it. It was simple. Uncomplicated. Just a quiet acknowledgement from a stranger who had, somehow, seen me when the people closest to me hadn't. I never replied. But I kept the letter. There were small moments in those winter months where I felt like I was reclaiming pieces of myself. I started writing again, just journaling at first. Then little story sketches. Eventually, I pulled out an old manuscript I'd abandoned years ago and started tinkering with it. I created a new corkboard in my office, pinned up pages and quotes, even recreated a few photos that I'd lost. It wasn't the same as what I'd had, but it didn't have to be. Sometimes I'd get random flashes of memory. The apartment in Chicago. Selena's laughter drifting through the walls when she was on the phone. The way the sunlight hit the hardwood floors in the early morning. I didn't fight those memories anymore. I let them pass through me like waves. I think the hardest part wasn't losing the physical things. It was losing the illusion that certain people would be there for me when it counted. There's something cruel about realizing your safety net was never real. That the people you believed would catch you were never even watching. But there's also something freeing about knowing that, and choosing to build a net of your own. One day in March, Nadine found an old photo tucked into a second-hand frame she'd bought at a flea market. It was black and white, two women standing arm in arm on a porch, laughing. Total strangers. But she gave it to me. They kind of look like us, she said. I hung it by my desk. A reminder, maybe, that sisterhood doesn't always come from history, it can come from now. From someone who shows up when it's cold and quiet and hard. Someone who helps you haul boxes and doesn't ask questions. Someone who never once said, "Why didn't you call us?" Because she already knew. Spring rolled in quietly that year, slipping under the frozen seams of winter without fanfare. I hadn't realized how tense my shoulders had been for months until one day in April, I stepped outside, smelled the thawing earth, and felt something strange in my chest. Relief. My case against Selena was still open, and though the legal back and forth had slowed down, my attorney assured me we were getting somewhere. She hadn't wanted to settle in full. She offered partial payment, then silence. But the paper trail was solid. Between the altered lease, the emails, and the signed statement from Mr. Avila, we had leverage. I wasn't chasing revenge in the cinematic sense, no dramatic confrontations or broken windows in the night. I just wanted her to face consequences. To understand that actions, especially selfish ones, ripple. That understanding came in the most unexpected way. My lawyer called me one Tuesday afternoon with a tightness in her voice that made me sit up straighter. "So, interesting update," she said. "Selena has acquired legal representation. They're pushing back, but not hard. I did some digging, and, well, you'll want to hear this. Selena had applied for a state-level fellowship that required a detailed background check. One of the stipulations was demonstrated ethical behavior in both academic and housing history. Her school had reached out for verification about her previous residences. Someone, likely Mr. Avila, had provided a very honest account of the forged lease incident. Suddenly, she was under academic investigation for misconduct. Not just for the lease, but because she had submitted her grad housing reimbursement using my information. My lease, my portion of rent, my name. And now the university was reviewing her entire assistantship. I didn't gloat. Not aloud. But I hung up the phone, sat in my tiny Milwaukee apartment, and smiled in a way I hadn't in months. I never had to lift a finger. Selena's own trail did the work for me. In late May, I got a final notice from her legal team, a full settlement offer. No long explanations this time. No apologies. Just the amount we had originally demanded, broken down to the cent. It arrived in the form of a cashier's check with a typed note: "This matter is now considered closed. No further contact will be made." Fine by me. With that money, I did three things. I bought a refurbished laptop and finally replaced the tech I'd lost. I invested in a few pieces of furniture that weren't from thrift stores or garage sales. And I made a donation in Selena's name to a local women's shelter in Chicago, anonymously, of course. I kept the receipt. Not out of spite. Just for myself. As for my parents, they faded out of my life like a bad dream. I didn't unblock their numbers. I didn't return the birthday card they sent with a $50 check tucked inside and a message scribbled in my mom's loopy script: "Hope you're healing. Let's not stay strangers." I wasn't staying a stranger. I was staying free. I wrote them a letter I never sent. In it, I explained how it felt to lie in a hospital bed and realize the people who raised you thought your silence was just inconvenience. How it changed something in me that can't be unchanged. How healing didn't include forcing broken relationships back into their original shapes. The biggest surprise of all came in late summer. Nadine and I were sitting at the park eating lemon ices when she casually mentioned a local writing group that met once a week at a nearby community center. I shrugged it off at first. I wasn't ready to talk to strangers, let alone read anything aloud. But she went. And came back raving. "You don't have to share anything," she said. "Just listen. Or bring one of your old pieces and read silently. No pressure." I finally gave in, more out of curiosity than anything. The group was small. A retired teacher. A shy teenage girl who barely spoke above a whisper. A guy who wrote terrible poetry but read it with such conviction you couldn't help but smile. And then there was me, notebook clutched like a shield. And I wrote. God, I wrote. All the things I'd wanted to say. The stories I'd lost, the ones I'd never dared to finish. They came back like muscle memory. Slowly, week by week, word by word, I stitched myself back into being.